Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. There will be others still joining because we're expecting quite a crowd today. But let's get going. First of all, my name is, for you, those of you who don't know me, Willem de Ruiter, Executive Director of VMA Group. Thank you all for joining, and I hope, first of all, that you're all safe, sound, and in good health. We have a very international mix today, from Greece to Sweden, from Portugal to Poland, representative of the companies we work for and the candidates we work with. I am extremely happy to welcome Jonathan Hemus, Managing Director in Insignia, who will present and guide us through reviewing crisis comms in the wake of COVID-19. We've run the webinar a few weeks ago for a UK audience, and the feedback we got emphasized that people took it back to their communication teams to somehow re-evaluate ongoing reputational activities. Before leaving the floor to Jonathan, just a few words about VMA Group. Our business is international search, recruitment and selection for marketing and communications vacancies for companies across Europe. Permanent positions, but also project or interim positions. And actually in the last few months, we have seen companies with busy comms departments needing very specific interim support. And we've been able to deliver just that. And we do actually expect sometimes overloaded marketing communications departments to need perm new talent. We hear that job requirements may change as a result of what's going on. In a way, one could say that the communications departments are being tested these days, I think. We're also supporting companies in reviewing their communication structures and capabilities. It seems that a lot is changing these days. And as VMA Group, we can benchmark, review ways of working, evaluate sitting team members, draft job specs, and of course, find new team members if need be. So if you need support in finding new talent, please let us know. Actually, the only thing we ask in return for offering this webinar is that you do mention VMA Group to your talent acquisition colleagues when your company starts recruiting, or alert us when your preferred supplier lists are being reviewed. Next to this, and also importantly, if you'd like to discuss your personal career developments or next steps, we'd be happy to have a conversation about this. Now, best to quickly move on to Jonathan. If after the presentation there are points you'd like to discuss, you can unmute and talk, or you can send a small notice text for Jonathan to pick up. So without further ado, Jonathan, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Willem. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who has joined us for this webinar today. As Willem says, it's clear from the geographic and sector diversity that sadly crisis communication is near the top of the agenda for most organisations at the moment and most communication professionals. A few words of introduction to me. My name is Jonathan Hemus. I am the Managing Director of Insignia. We are a specialist crisis management consultancy. We help leaders of businesses, including Cathay Pacific, Lidl, Clifford Chance and Sky, to do and say the right things on the worst days of their business lives. And sadly, not just our clients, but also businesses around the world have been having those worst days of their business careers all at the same time, which is one of the things that makes this current crisis very different. My background is in communication, so I've worked in-house and within medium and very large international PR consultancies before setting up Insignia 11 years ago. And let me make sure I can, there we go. And my passion really, and the passion of the business, the purpose of the business is this, that the reason I started the business was because it really upset me to see good organizations full of phenomenal people do the wrong things in a crisis, and as a result of that, to cause themselves a lot of damage in terms of reputation and value, but also a lot of needless harm to their stakeholders, their employees who maybe lose their jobs, communities, let's say it's an environmental incident, their investors. my passion is to help to reduce the opportunity for that damage to occur. So our work is very much around helping organisations to plan, prepare, train, and then to advise and support organisations as they actually go through a crisis. And clearly, the situation that we're talking about at the moment has had a major impact on many businesses and, more importantly, many human lives. And what I'm going to talk about over the course of the next about 35-40 minutes, allowing a good 15 minutes for questions, is something that communicators have an influence over. How do you want to be remembered after all this? I want to major on what we are calling the danger zone, which we are already a few steps into already, and I'll explain more about that in a few minutes' time. Thirdly, how to review what you have done so far, how you have communicated so far, but then also how you can map your route into the future, and again, what that means for communication, leaving, as I say, 15 minutes or so for questions at the end. So yeah, here's the question, and it's one that I hope you and your organizations have been asking yourselves and then making the right decisions and saying the right things throughout the pandemic. How do you want to be remembered? Because if there's one thing that 30 years in crisis communication and crisis management has taught me, it's that out of a crisis always emerge heroes and also villains. And at this, very challenging time when businesses and reputations are very much on the line, I think it's more critical than ever that you come out of this situation looking like a hero rather than a villain, because the penalties of being a villain, I think, are even higher now than they would normally be. And we've seen, really good practice and some of the business heroes as well as the human heroes emerging. This is a UK car insurance firm who did something that insurance companies are not well known for doing, which is to proactively say to its customers, we would like to give you a partial refund because we understand that you're not able to use your cars at the moment. And more than that, anybody who works in the health or care sector, we are going to give you particular support and even bigger discounts. And they did that without being pushed to do that. It was the right thing to do. It was not only an admirable thing to do, and it resulted in a really warm feeling towards them. In France, we saw LVMH being really innovative and being very nimble in how it switched from producing luxury perfumes to producing hand sanitizer over a 72-hour period. And the luxury goods market is one that has a mixed reputation. And so to do something unexpected, but absolutely in the public and national good, was not only the right thing for LVMH to do, but was a really smart reputational move. Others, so there are two heroes. Others have not fared so well. This is the UK's biggest sports goods retailer, who did two things very early on in the early stages of the outbreak. Number one was to try and position themselves as a critical resource. In other words, they had to stay open because their goods were of critical importance to the UK public's health. It was perceived actually to be a way of simply staying open to keep the tills full of money, and the government said, no, you're not a critical resource. On the back of that, instead, they increased the prices of their home fitness products immediately after being told to shut down the physical stores, thereby being seen to profiteer from the fact that people would have to stay at home and not be able to go to gyms. This is an organisation with a mixed, at best, reputation already, which has certainly made that reputation worse during the outbreak. And I think what's really interesting is that even organizations who didn't have mixed reputations, for example, Virgin Atlantic and Richard Branson himself, have had a challenging time in terms of reputation because of what they have done during the pandemic. And so when Richard Branson asked for a government bailout for his Virgin Atlantic airline, that was a counterproductive move because people said, you are a multi-billionaire, why don't you put your hand in your own pocket first? So it's fascinating to see that even those that have built up phenomenal reputations over the years are still vulnerable during the pandemic. So that's what we've seen, in that initial outbreak and the initial crisis communication response. We are now moving into what I would describe as the danger zone. So from a business point of view, we've all been facing enormous challenges over the last 3, 4, 5 months, depending on, when COVID-19 came to your particular country. As we come out of that first phase and as lockdowns around Europe are removed or reduced, I believe there is a new danger zone, and one which is potentially even more damaging and risky for businesses than the first phase. And I'm sorry to say that, but I believe it's true. Why? Well, firstly, simply because surprise is no longer an excuse. So for organizations to be wrong-footed and to say or do the wrong things in that very first phase when coronavirus was new and for most people unexpected, there was kind of forgiveness for organizations for doing that, because who could have predicted this? Now, surprise is certainly no longer an excuse. People that fail to do and say the right things in response to COVID-19 now cannot use surprise as an excuse. Secondly, simply your resources are depleted now. We know that people are successfully working from home, but we're probably not up to the same level of efficiency or capacity that we were before the virus struck. So in terms of human resource and maybe financial resource, businesses are not in such a strong position now as they were at the beginning of 2020. I believe there is now greater media scrutiny of individual businesses. In the first phase of the pandemic, the story was about the whole situation, the big situation, the thing that was sweeping the entire world. Again, as we move into this next phase, I think there will be far greater media scrutiny and potentially criticism of individual organizations that get it wrong. I think in the first phase, there was almost safety in numbers, and your individual business or organization was hidden amongst the crowd. Fourthly, there are higher customer expectations of businesses now. The vast majority of businesses responded really well and in a very human and authentic manner to the first phase of the virus, and that has set higher expectations than were previously in place. So if businesses go back to being, profit, 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 rather than people, 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 I think again that will cause damage to reputation. The fifth one is a real critical point. We know what enormous challenges people have been through. We know that from a personal point of view, anxiety and stress levels and mental health has been, a bigger issue than ever before. And in the early stages of a crisis, from a kind of professional point of view, there's that adrenaline, there's that energy that actually working to respond to a crisis in the first phase, a lot of organizations and a lot of communication teams got by on adrenaline and a sense of purpose and a sense of service. As we now look ahead to sorry, first use of that phrase, new normal, how are we going to maintain morale and motivation and inspiration and energy as we have to continue to deal with the outputs of the virus? And the final one is repeat offenders will be punished. What do I mean by that? Well, organisations that did get things wrong in the first phase, as I say, will typically be forgiven. And this is true in my experience in all types of crisis. An organisation is forgiven for one slip up, one crisis, but if there's a second, and certainly if there's a third, that forgiveness is in very short supply. So in summary, I really believe that now is a time when reputation is even more vulnerable for businesses, brands and organizations than it was in the first phase. This is some research that we did with 100, just under 197, I think it was in the end, clients and contacts about how they were feeling and what they'd experienced in the first phase. So 62%, 6 out of 10, agreed that they are now more vulnerable to the impacts of a crisis than before COVID-19, and that's because of a lot of these factors. Only 30% of the people we talked to said their crisis management plan had worked extremely well in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. A number also said it worked well, but there were a smaller proportion that said it didn't work well at all. Only 42% of businesses are confident that they can respond successfully to another crisis in the next 6 months. Only 45% are confident that they can respond successfully to a second coronavirus outbreak, and 42% said another crisis would have a serious or extremely serious impact on their business. So I guess what this says is businesses recognize that they're vulnerable, and really now is the time to do something about it. And in the words of Dr. Hans Kluge, director of the World Health Organization, he said a couple of weeks ago, now is the time for preparation, not celebration. And I would absolutely endorse that. It's not a time to relax, sadly, whilst that would be very nice. And that's been proven by what we're seeing, and forgive the rather graphic picture on this media article, but around Europe, we've been hearing about what's been going on at Tönnies, the German meat processing business, whereby they have had to shut down this particular abattoir because of a very, very big outbreak, which has also affected the local community as well as the business itself. And Tönnies are being severely criticised for allowing this to happen and for their lack of an adequate communication response to it. So it's a very unfortunate but a very powerful reminder of what I was saying earlier on, that organizations may have been forgiven in the first wave. That is absolutely not the case now. But it's not just them. And it's not just COVID-related crises. In the States, Dow has been dealing with a big environmental incident in Michigan, and they've been challenged to respond to that, whilst at the same time continuing to respond to the COVID crisis. Cyber attacks. For the 2 years before the pandemic broke out, about half of all of the exercises we ran were about preparing for a cyber attack. Sadly, that threat has not gone away. In fact, it has increased. It's increased because with more people working from home and security lower than it would otherwise be as a result, cyber criminals are taking the opportunity to target organizations when they perceive they are vulnerable. They're also engaging in a lot of phishing attacks with emails supposedly from people's banks, online retailers, health organizations, knowing that people are in a state of anxiety and maybe their vigilance isn't at the same levels, and people are clicking on those links, and then the ransomware or whatever else it is that comes on the back of it is occurring. And for Honda, it actually hasn't been it hasn't been kind of financial details that they've been struck with. It's an operational issue. Their production facilities were hit by a cyber attack in a big ransomware attack. So it's not just COVID. It could be, you know, what everyone was worried about before COVID, which was a cyber attack. It could be the return of a previous issue. 3 weeks ago, VW lost a legal case related to Dieselgate. We all remember Dieselgate and the tamper devices that were being put into cars to get through the diesel emission tests. All of these things chip away at an organization's reputation when they're already depleted. Reputational issues. So Black Lives Matter, stimulated by the George Floyd outrage in the States. You may or may not have seen that the former CEO of CrossFit tweeted in a very controversial manner about Black Lives Matter. Reebok cut its ties with CrossFit on the back of the reputational damage that they perceived. Greg Glassman stepped down as CEO, and just yesterday he sold the business. So reputations can be damaged or even destroyed overnight at a time like this, and that this and other situations which have occurred and which we may see occurring over the coming few weeks very much reinforce this quote from Warren Buffett, who said, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently." This is absolutely a moment in time, this danger zone when all of your hard work as communicators to build reputations can be destroyed overnight. Reputations are particularly fragile at the moment, and the external context in which we're operating is more threatening at the moment. So, how do we navigate that danger zone? The first thing I would say, and this is easier said than done, but I believe it's really important. It is about stepping back before you step forward. We always advise our clients when they come out of a crisis to review what they did and said, identify what they learned from it, and implement improvements and actions to address what they learned before moving back to business as usual. Because if they don't do that, when the next crisis happens, all of the flaws that were in the original plan or approach or what they learned will still be a problem when the next crisis happens. And I think that is particularly relevant in terms of learning from the first 3 to 5 months of the pandemic response. So it may be kind of counterintuitive when you're all going at 150 kilometers an hour trying to get through work with smaller teams than usual, but I really would encourage you to, in a structured way, take between 2 and 4 hours out to review what you've done so far and what that means for the future. And let me show you a couple of structures for those sessions that we have been delivering for our clients that you can borrow and use within your teams, or of course you can ask us to run them for you. But first of all, a review of your overall crisis communication response. This is effectively a structure and agenda for a 2 to 4 hour session that I would encourage you to run with your communication colleagues. So, first of all, remind yourselves, what were our crisis communication objectives for COVID-19? And how did that play out in practice? And that's important to ask those 2 questions, because you then set out, what were we seeking to achieve? What did we want to happen? And what actually happened? And then we can start to identify if what actually happened was different to what we hoped would happen, why was it different? What went well? What didn't go so well? Now, it is just as important to identify what went well as what didn't go well. Often we only look at the negative side and the downside and things we need to change or do better or add. But it is important to identify what went well. Why is it important? Well, one, because you will all deserve a big round of applause for all the great work that you have done. But equally importantly, we need to embed good practice in future ways of working. Unless you identify it, you won't embed it. What didn't go well, of course, is also important. And what didn't go well, it could be about identifying that processes didn't work as we wanted, and we need to improve those. It could have been that things were missing. It could mean that there's something that we thought would work really well and it didn't, and we need to stop doing that. So what didn't go well? And with hindsight, what would we do the same? What would we do differently? I'd also encourage you not only to kind of review your overall response, but also to look very specifically at the materials that you produced, your briefings for your internal colleagues, the statements that you put on your website, the messages that you sent out to your customers, and just take a step back and say, you know, with hindsight, are they as good as they could have been? How would we draft them differently if we had our time again? And it'd be a great idea to take stakeholder feedback as you conduct that review. Ask your people, you know, did you feel that we communicated with you well? What could we have done better, more frequently, different channels, different messages? And the last bullet point, of course, which is the final element of the review, is the most important one: committing to action to address whatever you find out. There's a second type of review as well, and for some clients we're doing both of these, for some clients we're doing one or the other. The second one focuses more on people than plans, because again, I know from speaking to many communication teams over the last few months that a lot of them are fatigued, weary, under pressure, anxious, and are running on empty at the moment. And this idea of having to maintain that level of focus and energy and momentum over the coming few months is challenging for many individuals. So a session, again, 2 or 3 hours, where you sit down as a team virtually and run through these questions, I think is a really useful taking of a step back again. So with your colleagues, how are we feeling now? What are we personally proud of? Because again, it's easy to forget what we've achieved. So much has been achieved that sometimes it's not properly recognized. So what are we proud of? What have we learned about ourselves? Again, working with clients, we have seen some extraordinary achievements from individuals that, you know, maybe the head of the department within the client side had not expected this particular person to rise to this particular challenge, or didn't know that they had this particular capability that really came to the fore because it was a crisis. What surprised us, and what have we found most challenging in working as a team through this process? Then how do we feel about the future? Let's look to the future. As we think about the next 3 months, the next 6 months, the next 12 months, what are our hopes for that? How do we hope it will play out? What are our fears? What are the things that we are concerned about? What help or support do we need as we start to gear up for this next phase of activity? What additional support do we need to make that journey a little bit easier? What would make our working lives better or easier? And again, then a commitment to action. These review sessions are enormously valuable and powerful, but only if we drive out actions and only if we actually take those actions. So looking back before looking forward, I would suggest is a really important thing to do. Firstly, in terms of how you communicated what you did, and secondly, in terms of how your team and your colleagues are feeling. Let's continue now by looking to the future, and thank goodness there's a sun, a ray of light from behind that cloud, and let's all hope that that sunshine comes shining through very, very soon. So as you start to think about the future, what should you be thinking about as a communications professional? Well, I would encourage you to reset or set your strategic intent or your strategic purpose. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, I think in terms of moving forward, it's really helpful to understand when we get to the end of this, what do we want to have achieved? Where do we want to be? And critically for communicators, how do we want to be seen? So imagine yourself 6 months into the future. How do you want to be seen then? And by understanding how you want to be seen and where you want to get to, it will make your decision making, your prioritization, and indeed your messaging and your communication that much more purposeful, because you will know what it is aimed at achieving. And clearly your strategic intent must align with your values. So work out where you want to be, let's say by the end of this year, and how you want to be seen by the end of this year, and that will sharpen the focus of your communication planning. And this is an example this was actually from the first phase of the pandemic, just to give you an idea of what a strategic intent could look like. For one of our clients, it was to take operational steps to emerge from the current situation as quickly and strongly as possible, whilst remaining true to our values and without jeopardizing our long-term vision. One of the other things I would encourage you to do right now as communicators is to reprioritize your stakeholders. And look at that photo. That photo was taken in February of this year, so that is less than 4 months ago, and it looks like a different world, doesn't it? That was the old way of communicating with colleagues and teams. I think in the first phase of this crisis, internal communication for most organizations with their people was the most important form of communication by a long way. And I think, organizations did really great work in that area. Internal communication is going to remain a priority in this new phase. But again, I would encourage you to take that step back, lift your head up and say, okay, in this new situation, yes, internal communication remains a high priority, but who else do we need to start reassuring or selling to or engaging? Because it may well not be exactly the same as it was only 6 weeks ago. I think it's also critical for you to reassess your reputational risk landscape. So, for those of you who have organizations which have done risk assessments as a matter of normal business in the past, and maybe you as a communication team have done your own reputational risk landscape, if that risk landscape was done prior to February or March, by definition, it is wrong, because the external context is dramatically different to what it was 4 or 5 months ago. And your internal context is also dramatically different from 4 or 5 months ago. So the outside world, the potential for risk and the types of risk that might occur is not the same. And your ability to respond to them and the impact on your organization from an internal point of view isn't the same. And so you need to reassess your reputational risk landscape, or risk your reputation being damaged or destroyed through not having done that. So ask yourself these questions, and this works particularly well if you risk assess against where you want to get to in 6 months' time, how you want to be seen in 6 months' time. What could happen to jeopardize achievement of our strategic intent? It could be something to do with people, it could be something to do with operations, financial, reputational, something that comes from outside. Go through the various parameters and say, what could happen to us to stop us achieving that reputation and that perception of our business in 6 months' time? How likely is it to happen? And how big would the impact be if it did happen? And then, of course, again, the important final step of this workshop approach, what actions can we take to reduce the likelihood of one of these risks occurring? You know, is there something we can do from a comms point of view or as a business point of view to make the risk less likely to happen? And if there isn't, or if we've done everything that we can, what contingencies can we put in place to reduce the impact of the crisis, of the risk, if it does happen? And that last one is where communicators can play a really valuable role, because it could be as simple as developing a set of communication materials, template holding statements, template social media content, template staff briefings, template customer briefings, Q&As that could be used on the website in draft, ready in the event that one of these risks occurs. I'm mindful of time. I've probably got about 10 minutes of content left, and I'm probably going to pick up the pace a little bit here. Having identified those key risks, I would also suggest it makes sense to scenario plan against those key risks. So let's say, for the sake of argument, actually a cyber incident is something which, on top of what you have been going through, is one of the things that could do further harm to your business and its reputation. You might very well want to scenario plan how a cyber incident might play out for your organization using these kinds of questions. What could trigger this scenario? What could cause it to take place? What would be our strategic intent in dealing with this particular scenario? So rather than getting, you know, a load of people around the table deciding when the cyber incident has occurred, what is our objective in this situation? Actually define it in advance. It saves time and achieves greater clarity of purpose. How would we respond? What would we do in response to this scenario? Who would need to be involved? What resources would we need? What decisions might we need to make? And those, you know, previous 3 bullet points, who would be involved? Well, if we worked out who it is, we need to brief them on what their involvement would be. If we need resources, it gives us time to put them in place before the event happens. If we would need to make decisions like, do we shut down our email server or not, we can have an in principle decision about whether we would shut the server down or not in this situation. And then again, as with the risks, we come on to how can we reduce the likelihood of this scenario occurring in the first place? What communication contingencies can we put in place? What can we prepare? What actions can we take? So walking through your nightmare scenarios in order to identify work that can be done now to make you better prepared should the scenario actually occur. Updating, or if you don't have one, creating your crisis management or crisis communication plan. This comes right back to doing review workshops. You know, they say, I think this is probably a general's quote who said, a plan is fantastic until it comes into contact with the enemy, and the first time that happens, you find out the plan isn't perfect. And no crisis management plan will be perfect, and you will have learned things about your crisis management or crisis communication plan during the first wave. So don't leave those flaws in your crisis management plan. Don't fail to add the materials that you wished that you had in your original plan. Now is absolutely the time to make sure that your crisis management or crisis communication plan is in the very best possible state it can be, because now that we're in this danger zone, it needs to support you through the next crisis, whether that's a second wave or whether it's a cyber attack or whether it's a product recall. because your organization, I believe, is likely to be more vulnerable to reputational risk than ever before, you want the very best plan supporting you at that time. And very quick advert for another webinar that we are running, Insignia is running next week, where we are going to cover off what does a really effective crisis management plan look like. And if you'd like to attend that, please, drop a line to Willem, who will forward it to me, or alternatively, I'm going to put my details up at the end, and please, I will be happy to invite you. So, other areas that we can help, there's a load of free resources on our website. I talked about reviewing your communication materials. You'll see on the screen now there is a free download that will give you a checklist against which you can review your communication materials. There are also recordings of webinars with senior communicators, for example, Gus Whitcomb from Cathay Pacific. If you'd like to hear their learnings from the first round of the pandemic, those are available on the website. But I guess my summary would be to say that, here are some of the headlines and some of the criticisms of the way that businesses and the world and governments responded to the first phase of this awful crisis. And a lot of the criticism is around organizations being in denial and not doing what they should have done to be ready to respond to the worst case scenario. As I said earlier on, there are now no excuses for not being ready to respond for the worst case. And now is very much the time to do that review of what went on in the first phase and making sure that you are fitter than ever to be able to successfully navigate through whatever the world is about to throw at you next.
Thank you very, very much, Jonathan. I hope all of you understand why we mentioned in the mails we sent out to you, inviting you for this webinar to probably discuss it with your team. Step back, learn, and think about next steps. Anyway, questions. There's one on the chat. Jonathan, can you see that?
Let me see if I can see that. I can't at the moment, but I'm sure I will be. Yes, I can, or I will be able to in a minute. From Ingrid. So many organizations now use the excuse of financial troubles to not engage with external partners to get prepared. What is your experience with this? Well, that's a great question, Ingrid. So I'll come at this from a slightly different direction. What we found, and I'm not just saying this is the truth, what we found was that the clients with whom we had worked to not only develop crisis management plans, but to do their training and exercising as well, performed significantly better than those organizations who had talked to us about investing in crisis management planning and training, but never quite got round to it. I'll give you an example of the former. We work with a big global mining company, and we've worked with them for about 7 years now. And every year we have run training and exercises at their facilities in Chile and Brazil and Sweden and Portugal and North America. And as a consequence, they activated their crisis management teams right at the beginning of February, before most of the rest of Europe and North America had even recognized that there really was a crisis coming. And then when it was even clearer that this was a real crisis, they were really on it in terms of making early decisions. They knew who to communicate with, they knew when to communicate with, and they got their messaging sorted out. We then also had a flurry of phone calls from, say, organizations that had been thinking about working with us before but hadn't, to say, frankly, help, we don't have a plan, we don't know what to do, please can you give us some advice now? Which of course we did, but it simply meant that they were playing catch up rather than having the materials and the confidence and the capabilities and the mindset to switch into gear. So I guess that's my long-winded way of saying my sincere wish is that organisations that didn't previously prepare will have learned from what has happened and their inability to respond in the best possible way to now invest time and money into making sure they are ready for the next phase. I recognise that a lot of businesses don't have as much money as they used to have, but I think it would be foolhardy in the extreme not to get yourselves ready for this next phase. And it can be relatively inexpensive. It doesn't have to be everything, but to review what happened in the first phase and to update your plan so you're ready, I think it would be negligent not to do that. So Kamal is asking, how do you suggest documenting all that has been done, like a playbook or something? So if I'm understanding that correctly, I'm going to interpret it this way. How do you document what you did in response to the crisis? Now, again, with our clients, what we encouraged them to do was to actually record how they had responded and what they learned as the crisis was playing out, because I think there is still real value in a review meeting for organisations that didn't do that, but to have contemporaneous notes to remind you of what you did and why and what you learned from it and what worked and what didn't work is an even more powerful way of being able to take learnings and actions from it. So as you move forward into this next phase, as you continue to grapple with this ongoing crisis, I would encourage you, as you go, it would have been really useful to have had a template holding statement there to record that fact, or that particular process within our plan didn't work. I need to make a note of that. That's something we need to address when we come back round to it. I'm also going to interpret your question, Kamal, in a different way, documenting all that's been done like a playbook. I'm going to briefly talk about crisis management plans, but do join our webinar next week because we've got a whole hour on that. A crisis management or crisis communication plan will never manage the crisis for you, and the longer and the more detailed the plan, in a way, the less useful it will be, because it is just so dense, so thick, that you can't use it in a crisis. A good crisis management or crisis communication plan should give you clarity about the most important things that you should be doing at a moment in time. It should give you checklists and materials and structure so that you have the right people doing the right things at the right time. And it should contain resources like template communication materials to save you time under pressure. It should not seek to answer every single situation. The one exception is, I talked quite a bit about risks and scenarios. You may very well find it useful to have a checklist or a series of steps to be taken against your top 5 risks or scenarios, but I would emphasize, do not be in a situation whereby your plan is only designed to deal with your top 5 scenarios, and when something completely different happens, it's not capable of working. So again, briefly, in the pandemic, some of our clients had pandemic specific plans. Some of them had general crisis management plans. Even the ones with the general crisis management plans were able to navigate the pandemic successfully, because the principles, structures and processes within the general plan lent themselves to the pandemic. Lars is asking, while preparing and training my crisis teams, it feels we need to move from face-to-face trainings to online. What is your experience with online trainings, e-learning for crisis preparedness? I absolutely agree, Lars. We were already finding before this situation that, the old days when a crisis management team or crisis communication team would physically sit around the same table were pretty much over. And what has happened, recently has accelerated that process. So clearly, very few crisis management or communication teams will be sitting physically around tables anymore. So We were already running virtual and online crisis training and exercising, which in reality more closely mirrors the real world than the old way of running it in a single room. There are, other communication platforms that we use as part of that. For example, we have a very realistic social media simulator that we use as part of online exercises. We have a way of generating real-time broadcast news in a very realistic way. And so, yes, I think whilst from time to time people will be managing crises in the same room, that's going to be less and less frequent, and therefore delivering training and exercising virtually is absolutely, in many instances, the way to go. Mark is saying, the media are the message I once learned. How did you experience the role of media in general, Jonathan, over the last month? So a couple of thoughts on that, Mark. Firstly, I do think that for businesses, as I say, in the first 2 to 4 months of this pandemic, a business had to do something really very, very wrong to be called out for criticism, because it was seen to be an extraordinary event and there was a bigger story to tell anyway. So it was only those organisations which, as I say, responded really horrifically badly that were called out. That is definitively changing now, as I say, expectations of businesses is increasing, and I think the media will revert back to scrutinising, criticising, challenging, holding businesses to account. What I'm also seeing is, we're doing work with a new client that runs care homes. They feel very wounded by what the media are saying about them because they don't feel it's true. But this thing about the media are the message, you just have to go with that. You just have to understand that that is the world that we operate in, and that's why, the role of communication and being proactive and effective in your messaging is so important. Christina, if you had one bit of advice to give us, so one thing only that you suggest we do regardless, what would that be? You will have heard from the amount of talking I've done, Christina, that I'm going to find that really hard, but here goes. I would ask you to run a review session and act on the learnings. There's a phrase, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Don't let this crisis go to waste, Christina. Willem, am I okay to take Ingrid's question as well?
Yeah, last one, and then I'll wrap up.
Okay, so Ingrid says, I've had the situation where HQ is centralizing crisis communication and crisis management team, leaving no room for local actions, initiatives, or interpretation, not necessarily jeopardizing global reputation, but potentially having a local reputational impact. Is HQ wrong? What would you advise to take crisis management one level down? 2-minute answer, Ingrid, but I'd be very happy to talk to you about that in more detail offline, because it's something I'm very passionate about. In a crisis, it is really important to understand roles and responsibilities and the respective roles and responsibilities of head office and the regions or the local teams. Head office should be responsible for direction, setting strategy, providing support and resources to the front line, and making the really big, critical decisions. They should be about facilitating and supporting what is going on at the front line, not micro-managing it. And the more responsibility for managing the local situation that can be delegated to the front line, the better. This situation, so I'm talking in general terms there, this situation has made that challenge 100 times bigger, because the pandemic was hitting different regions and countries at different times, and different countries were giving different advice. So although it's really difficult, my best advice would be, yes, I still think HQ should set overall direction and take the very, very big decisions, but I think they have to even more trust the people in the regions and the markets to nuance or, you know, change what is done in their country. I think if you try and impose that robustly from the centre, you will lose reputation within the markets. And I understand how difficult that is, because it's hard for head offices to relinquish that control. But I think in this situation where organisations have done that, it's worked successfully, even if it's been a bit uncomfortable.
Thank you, Jonathan. As before, a very brilliant presentation. Thanks a lot, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all those who attended. For information, next to webinars like this, we do organize regular, small, intimate round table sessions where there's a lot of room to share experiences with your peers. One of the things we've learned relates to, of course, to what Jonathan has been describing. Communications definitely has a seat at the table these days. It was not always the case like that before, but it definitely has happened. And the comms directors we've been talking to, they seem to be struggling with, on the one hand, paying extreme attention to employee engagement and everything related. And at the same time, they are preparing for future strategic developments. Very black and white, telling everybody they're the most important asset of the company today, knowing that a couple of months down the line, you may have to let 20% of them go. And there's a lot of scrutiny. Take the airlines, for example, getting massive support from the government, Lufthansa, KLM, Air France. But pressure on the green agenda is mounting as well from the public. And also these companies may have to reorganize. So these are the balances where we think that communications will remain critical, and people need the skills and capacities to find the right narratives and the right tone of voice. On that, I'd like to end the session with one last remark. Allow me, please, to do so. Recruitment, think VMA, personal career development, give me a call. Thank you all for attending, and have a lovely day. Hope to speak to you soon.